Welcome to the KidMin Podcast with Dr. Val and Dr. Virginia, where we talk about everything KidMin
and pull back the curtain on some of the surprises and challenges in children's ministry that nobody prepares you for.
I'm Dr. Val, and together we have over 45 years of experience in children's ministry.
I'm Dr. Virginia. Valerie and I met over 10 years ago in our doctoral program at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. We are excited to share with you all the great stuff that we have picked up over the years. We want to minister to you, the children's minister.
Welcome, friends. Thank you so much for joining us today. Dr. Virginia and I are excited to be continuing in our series on learning styles. I know if you have been following us and you're not super familiar with learning styles, you might be wondering, how long is this going on and why do they keep talking about it? But one of the things that we are very passionate about is active learning. And I believe that Dr. Howard Gardner's research on multiple intelligences, what we know as learning styles, is just a really amazing way to help you be able to process how children learn and how we can better meet their needs in a classroom. And so when Virginia and I started this series, what feels like a very long time ago, we decided to do an episode on each one of the learning styles just to give you an idea of how you can focus in on each learning style in a different way in a classroom as you're planning your material, your curriculum, as you're looking through how you're going to set up your programs for the year. And so just to kind of give you a quick reminder, if you haven't heard any of these episodes before, Dr. Howard Gardner wrote a book many years ago about multiple intelligences. And his philosophy was everything that's worth learning can be taught in different ways. And so he had 8 basic learning styles. Over the years, they were added to, they were taken away from, they were changed, but we have these 8 basic learning styles that we, sort of work from as we're looking at a classroom, as we're setting up material, as we're looking at how we can teach children. Knowing that just because you believe that you might have one of these learning styles, it doesn't mean that you might not have 2 or 3. You can learn from all 8. But Dr. Gardner's theory was that we were created specifically, the way that our brain works individually is leaning towards one of these particular styles. It's how you learn best. It's how you're most comfortable learning. And so that is why he wanted to make sure that we had a wide range of knowledge as an educator of all the different types of learning styles so that we can best meet the children's needs. Those 8 styles in no particular order are visual, learning through sight. Kinesthetic is learning through movement. Auditory is learning through sound, music, and rhythm. Verbal is learning through words. Logical learners learn more mathematically. We have relational learners that learn with other people. We have reflective learners who enjoy learning individually by themselves. And then we have natural learners who like to learn through nature, who enjoy being outside and learn best through nature. So when you look at all 8 of these learning styles, it gives you the opportunity to be able to create specific activities in your classroom so that each child can process and learn. Now, you're never going to use all 8 styles in one classroom time. There's not enough time to be able to do that. You can't do that. But the idea is that you think through the learning styles and try to pepper those throughout time with your kids so that different weeks, they have different experiences, they have different opportunities to learn, and they can just have things more individualized for them.
And I think having a familiarity with these learning styles also helps you reframe kids' behaviors in the classroom.
Right.
It helps you reframe why they're doing what they're doing.
Yes.
Maybe Jimmy is always talking because he is a relational learner
Right.
and because that's what helps him process information.
Mhm.
Maybe Susie is always moving because she's a kinesthetic learner and that's what helps her pay attention and focus and retain this. And so
Right.
it's useful too in that it helps you sort of look at your kids differently,
Right.
because what may seem on the surface as disruptive behavior or disobedient behavior, really it's them. They're trying to meet a need.
Right.
They are trying to focus in whatever way helps them to focus best, like the
Right.
kid who taps or drums with their pencils all the time.
Yes.
And so it helps give you a framework for understanding kids' behavior and then for knowing and having tools to respond to that, to what you're seeing in a way that's constructive, to proactively help that student who's always drumming with their pencils have
Yes.
opportunities to learn in their preferred learning style, like in a musical or auditory learning style.
Right.
That's going to help them. It's going to help direct maybe some of these behaviors that you might be struggling with and utilize them in an intentional way and help kids learn in ways that are going to be best suited for them and help them retain the information.
Right. Right.
Um,
And that doesn't mean that you have to have each one of these things in your classroom, like I said
all
before,
the
every
time.
single week or all the
Yeah.
time. But we've mentioned this before in previous episodes. We tend to teach in the way that we enjoy learning the most.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And so, for example, I am a visual learner. And so I tend to gravitate more towards those activities. And I am not very comfortable in nature. So I am not really great in incorporating the outside world inside a classroom. I have to really be intentional and specific to do that. But I also know that I'm going to have kids in my classroom that really respond to those activities. So I need to make sure that I am incorporating them. And the only way I can do
mm-hmm.
that is by learning more about those activities to be able to.
Mhm, mhm, and just being intentional and building them in and choosing them and structuring them, even if it's not your favorite thing or
Right.
something that feels awkward. So, yeah.
For sure, for sure. Well, today we're going to be talking about logical learners. And this one is very
Mhm.
near and dear to my heart because my husband is a logical learner and I
Oh.
am not. And so we have often found that these two different learning styles can be difficult when you're trying to process and understand information.
Mm,
One of
mhm,
the examples that I have given often is that if my husband has lost his keys, because I am a visual learner and I process things visually, when I lose something, I play a little movie in my mind. All right, when I came home from the grocery store, I walked through the door and I came into the kitchen and I set my keys down on the counter. And then and that's how I will find my keys. I process that little, movie in my head so that I can visually picture where did I leave them last. So when Lewis loses his keys, my question is usually, where is the last place you remembered having them? Well, for Lewis, as the logical person that he is, he always answers the same way. If I knew where I had them last, I would know where they are. And I'm trying to explain to him, no, I'm asking
Oh.
him to think through, but he is trying to figure out logically, well,
Yeah.
where would I have left my keys? Well, I could have left them, and so he's processing the
Mhm,
question completely in a different way than I am. And so I think that that's one of the things about
mhm,
learning styles when we get to know people better and we start to
mhm,
understand the way their brain processes and the way that they think.
mhm,
Not everyone always thinks in the way we think that
mhm,
they do.
mhm,
And I
mhm.
find that fascinating when you see on social media, people will be talking about that. I think I
Yeah.
mentioned before, I saw someone mention that they do not visually see things in their minds.
Mhm,
Like if
mhm,
you say the word apple to me, I picture a red apple in my mind. but a lot of people don't have that visual ability. And when you say the word apple to
Mhm.
them, they don't think of anything. They don't picture anything in their minds.
Mhm.
And I just assumed that everyone did growing up because I did. So I
You're
thought
not inside
everyone
anyone
did.
else's brain, so
Right.
how would you know?
You
Yeah.
wouldn't know. But there are a lot of people who don't think that way. So we
Mhm.
have to be very mindful of it. So I have to be mindful of my logical learner that's in my home and think about those things when I am trying to impart wisdom, when I am trying to teach a new concept, or when we're trying to learn something together. I have to keep that in mind so that I can try to make the situation as pleasurable as possible and not get so frustrated when we cannot find the keys because he
Ah,
loses things all the time. So
ah.
all right, just to talk a little bit about logical learners and a little bit about some of the characteristics that you might see with logical learners is one, they are going to see the world more as black and white. Logical learners do tend to see things in a very scientific, methodical way.
Mm,
So there are processes and ways to do everything. And so they are going to see things in a very specific way. That means that sometimes logical learners will have a harder time understanding faith because they have a harder time understanding things that you cannot see.
mm,
And so when you can't give them scientific evidence or proof of something, when you can't show them scientifically, the way things work, they really start to struggle with processing that concept. So they're going to ask a
mhm,
lot of hard questions, and they're
mhm,
going to ask a lot of whys
mm,
and hows.
mhm,
These are the kids that are not being rude or difficult.
mm. Yeah, yeah.
They just really want to know why. And one of the
Mhm,
things that I have learned over the years in church settings, especially because of my husband, as we talked about just a minute ago, is that a lot of times people look at those why and how questions as being rude or sacrilegious or inappropriate.
mm,
But a lot of times when you're looking at a logical learner, someone who learns in a
mhm,
very scientific way,
mhm,
they are looking for that proof for that answer, and they're looking for you to be able to give them a specific process and an
mm,
explanation. And so
mhm.
when you come to topics of faith, it's harder to be able to give that concrete proof
Yeah.
and information.
Mhm. And I think too, I think whenever kids or adults or anyone asks you a hard question and you're not sure how to answer it, just being like, I am not sure if Adam and Eve had belly buttons.
Yeah.
Let's do some research, or let me go look up some information and let's talk about this again next week. And
Right.
if little 7-year-old Jimmy is asking you about Adam and Eve's belly buttons, next week he's gonna remember, so you
Oh,
better
yeah,
go look it up.
he is.
So,
It is always okay to say, "I don't
yeah,
know."
yeah,
One of the things
yeah,
I always say is that God can handle the big questions. He can
yeah.
handle the hard questions. And if we
Mhm,
don't know the answer to it, it's perfectly
mhm,
fine to say, "You know what? I don't know, but let me see
mhm,
if I can find an answer for you." And
mhm,
sometimes answers aren't going to be enough because, like I said, we don't necessarily have a picture of Adam and Eve to go back to look at to see, if they did
uh,
have a belly button or not. So,
yeah,
sometimes people just have to take our word for what we know or that we're not
right,
sure or that nobody knows. And that's something that
right.
God will have to tell us later, but we have to be good with being able to do that.
And I think too, with some of those questions, I think also being able to pull it back around to key theological truth and the gospel, and being like, nobody really knows if Adam and Eve had belly buttons, but
Right.
whether they did or whether they didn't, that does not affect our view of who Jesus is, of the truth of scripture, of
Right.
the way God works in our lives. And so, I think, and not every question is going to be like that, but I think
Right, right.
sometimes even whenever you don't have the answer, you
Mhm.
can still circle it back around and be like, whatever the answer to this is, God knows the answer, and whatever it is,
Right,
it doesn't change our views on, these key theological truths. And so
right.
I think that can help logical learners
Mhm.
whenever you reground them into the things that they do know and that we do hold dear and that aren't changed by
Right,
whatever the answer to this question is.
right,
So,
right, right. Well, let's look at just a few of the activities that you can do in a
mm,
classroom to help logical learners to be able to process and understand information better. There are
mhm,
so many wonderful games and activities that we can do in a classroom to help further the biblical message that you're giving them to make
mhm,
sure that the main point stays the main point, as you said. And one of the things about logical learners, they do tend to be good with numbers. So anytime that you can bring numbers into
mm,
an activity, anytime you can bring numbers into the story that you're telling or the games that you're doing, that's going to just draw a little bit more interest in for those logical learners because they do tend to be very good in math and in science.
mm.
Because again, we go back to what's logical. We're looking at those things that have a logical answer and reason for.
And what's funny, I'm smiling and like a little bit like chuckling internally. I mean, again, I think we all have, certain preferred learning styles. And I think I lean into the logical learning style. I don't know that it's like my top one, but I definitely lean into it because as we're sitting here talking with numbers, the first thing I'm thinking is like, yeah, man, bring these kids in, teach them about Fibonacci's sequence, which is
Yes.
like, this mathematical principle that you see
Mhm,
all over nature and like seashells and in like the petals of sunflowers about
mhm,
the way that these things grow and develop and arrange. It follows this like mathematical pattern that repeats
yeah.
itself. And so it's funny, maybe I'm more of a logical learner than I than I
Then
thought
you
if I'm
thought
suggesting people to teach kids about Fibonacci sequence. So
well, there are so many ways to bring
uh,
numbers into Bible stories, like
yeah,
you said. It
yeah.
shows how God has created everything. But,
Mhm,
look at the story of Noah and the ark, bringing the animals
mhm,
in two by two. If you look at the
mhm,
feeding of the 5,000 and you look at the numbers that are included in that particular story, there are so many stories that you can
mhm,
bring the 12 disciples. And so
mhm,
anytime you can bring in items where they can count items, where they can put items into categories by number, then that's going to just draw their interest. Anytime that you can play a game where you can roll a game cube and they're moving a certain number of
mhm,
spaces and those kinds of things, that's going to bring numbers into your lesson. So there's a ton of ways to be able to do that. You're not necessarily teaching math, but it's taking mathematical concepts
mhm.
and using it to show them God's truth. And so yeah, that's what's so awesome about it. And that's what's so great. Um, Another really great thing,
Mhm,
timelines.
mm,
Logical learners love to put things in order and in
mhm,
sequence. And so anytime you can use a timeline or have a
mhm,
timeline to help them to be able to process a story,
mhm,
I like using cards that help them put the events of the Bible story that
mhm,
you're learning in order because again that's making a timeline. This is
mhm,
what happened first, this is what happened next, the last thing that happened was here. So it helps them to be able to process things in a logical way and so they can think through the story by doing that. When you can classify objects into categories, when you can help them to be able to see, one of the things that I love to do with kids is to have items where they can divide things out into groups, where you have like a
mhm,
big bag full of just different things that relate to the story and let them pull them
mhm,
out and put 5 pennies here, put five pieces
mhm,
of like a picture of a fish here for 5 loaves, five, like
mhm.
having the numbers where they can put things into categories and they can classify objects is gonna be very helpful for them.
And one thing, because I like using timelines, and I just kind of tend to naturally gravitate towards them. One, because I want my students to learn and my kids to learn that the Bible is one big story. And
Mhm,
so, kind of understanding where this takes place in the big story of the Bible, understanding how this relates to God's big plan of redemption through Jesus. And so I definitely like timelines in really, I guess, sort of in my philosophy of how I like to teach the Bible, is in helping kids understand that it's all connected.
Yes.
Because I think one of our challenges is that kids can grow up with a kind of, unfortunately, sort of disjointed view of scripture
Mhm.
where, they don't know who came first between David or Moses, or,
Mhm.
they don't understand how all these things fit together. And so I think the more that we can give them that big comprehensive picture of the Bible,
Mhm.
the better they'll understand it, the more it'll make sense. And just we just set them up to understand scripture well throughout their entire life. So
Well, because there's a huge difference between what's happening in the Old Testament and the New Testament,
mhm,
because there is this large gap of what the scripture teaches us about life before Jesus and what it teaches us about life after Jesus. And I think that we need to help kids understand that timeline and see how the Old
mhm,
Testament was a tutor to Christ.
mhm,
And we see all of the
mhm.
ways that it's woven together, but they have to be able to understand the whole big
The whole
picture of it.
picture. Yeah. And
And
even
so
understanding like the cycles of the Old Testament. Like we've talked about this before in more like devotional contexts on previous episodes, but
right.
like the cycles of the Old Testament, how, the Israelites will follow God and then fall into sin and then follow God and then fall into sin. And
Uh-huh.
so, seeing these cycles repeated over and over, God shows us those cycles over and over for the purpose of understanding that he is the redeemer. He is
Right.
the one who enters into our mess and
Right.
pulls us out of that. And so
Right.
we just see that happening over and over. So
Mhm. Yeah, so it's huge. I That's another reason why I love using maps. I
mhm,
tend to use maps a lot, especially
mhm,
with logical learners, but I love to use them in the
mhm,
classroom because I want to be able to show them when we're talking about the Israelites leaving Egypt and walking in the wilderness so that they can see where that was and how they moved and what
mhm,
each area was and Paul and the missionary journeys and all of these kinds of things. I just feel like when they can see a map,
mhm,
it's the same sort of as looking at that timeline where they can actually
mhm,
visually see the locations and have this better picture if they're able to look and follow where they traveled
mhm,
and where they lived and how that is in
mhm,
relation to the rest of the world. And so I think it's just really important for us to bring those types of things in to help
mhm,
logical learners really dig into the reality of what you're teaching so that they can see this was a
mhm.
real place. This is where it was
Yeah.
located in the world. This is where it is on the
Yeah.
map. And so it's just going to help them with not only with that black and white view, but also just
Mhm.
that logical sequencing kind of
And it makes
process
it more
that they do.
concrete. It makes
Yeah.
it more concrete, like they can wrap their hands around it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, so
Mhm.
I think that that's great. I think that that's again, critical thinking skills are gonna be really high on the list of things that you can do with these particular learners in a classroom.
Mm,
So they enjoy figuring out solutions to real world problems. So if you can take the story that you're teaching and make it applicable to life and
mm,
have them help you work through situations in how in my life as a
mm,
fourth grader can I take this
mm,
Bible story and apply it to a practical part of my life. And so it's
mhm,
helping them with those critical thinking skills, but giving them the opportunity to solve real world problems through what
mhm,
we're learning in scripture. And so I think life application is a very important piece of that puzzle for them because it helps them to be able to take what they're learning and it not just become just a story that happened
mhm,
2000 years ago that isn't going to be helpful to me at all and really be able to say this is how I can incorporate this into my life.
mhm. And, just thinking through that, like, Jesus tells us to love our enemies. Well, enemy, that almost sounds like something out of like a storybook or, a villain. But so you may not think of people as your enemies, but how could you apply this to someone in your life who is difficult to love or,
Right, right.
you know?
So it's helping them
Uh,
process through how
yeah.
this is applicable
Connect
to
those
my life.
dots.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
Logical learners are also going to enjoy experiments. They love to see how things work and what will happen with things. And so, anytime you can bring a little bit of science
Mm-hmm.
into the classroom, any way that you can show some of just the wonders of what God has made and what God has done. And I think that that's going to just be very interesting to them. It's going to be very intriguing to them. Again, we need to make sure that we are not offended by questions. And so we need to be very prepared, especially if you have a very strong logical learner in your classroom. You need to be very prepared with your lesson when you walk into that room so that you can answer those hard questions, but also don't be offended by those hard questions because they don't really mean it in a difficult way. They are asking it because they genuinely are trying to process and figure this out and understand it. And so we need to be very willing to give them time to ask the questions that they have. Because if we're not giving them the time to ask the questions out loud, they're processing it in their brains and they're not processing on what you have for them to do next. So you want to give them time to be able to get that off of their mind so that they can move on to the next thing. So you want to give them that space to be able to think through their answers for certain questions.
And even thinking about, because I mean, some kids it's just question after question after question. And you're like, man, like we are constantly getting derailed.
Mhm.
And, for those kids who are very, very inquisitive, can you give them like a little notebook where through the course of the morning, they write down all of their questions and then you set aside 10 minutes at the end of the class time while everyone else is doing their craft or eating their snack or whatever. And you and Jimmy go aside and he just reads off all of his little questions
Right.
from the morning. And, you process through all of those things that they're wondering about.
Mhm.
So that's
A
that's a
lot of
thought to keep that from
oh,
derailing the lesson. Yeah.
for sure, because I've had a lot
Mhm,
of deals that I have made with those kids over the years where I
mhm,
say, I kind of bring them aside and I say, I love your questions. I love
mhm,
hearing your questions. I love being able to answer your questions. But, we have a big classroom and we have a lot of friends, and all of our friends want to answer questions too. So, how about we make a deal that you can ask me 3 questions during our story time? And then after that, we will ask at we you can ask those questions at another time. So again, it's
mhm.
that kind of like it's okay to set limits. You
Yeah.
want to give them chances to be able to
Mhm,
ask questions, to be able to get those things off of their brain, but you also do
mhm.
have to maintain the classroom. And
Yeah.
because they are logical learners, they do understand that process. If you explain to
Right.
them why
What's
there
gonna
is a
happen? Yeah.
rule, why something
Mhm,
has to happen, they typically
mhm,
can process and understand that and go, "Oh, okay, so I get my 3 questions." And so that's
mhm,
their, so they kind of know that. And I think that that's too why a lot of logical learners really struggle functioning in
mhm,
areas of confusion or chaos.
mhm,
So if the classroom doesn't have any kind of structure,
mhm,
if there is a lot of chaos in the room, those kids are going to really, really struggle
mhm,
because they look at the world in a very organized, certain kind of way.
mhm,
And so when you have unspecified goals, when
mhm,
you start to do a game and then you change the rules,
mhm,
if you start to do an activity and then suddenly you change it into something else, those kids are going to struggle more with that because they have already set in their minds exactly
mhm,
what you've had in place. And
mhm,
so you want to make sure that you think through your classroom and how
mhm,
things function and how you do
mhm,
things during that time.
mhm,
Too much repetition is gonna get frustrating.
mhm,
Too much chaos is going to be frustrating. So you
mhm,
want to think through those. If you have a child that is very logical in the way that they process and think, then they are going to really struggle and it's gonna be very frustrating for them
mhm,
if there is a
mhm,
lot of chaos. So you want to make sure
mhm,
that you think about that if you have those kids in the classroom that really need structure and specific goals.
mhm. 'Cause I think the something that's beneficial really for probably all kids, but especially for your logical learners is routine.
Mhm.
So if there is predictable routine to your time in the classroom. Like, okay, we start out with maybe some free play, which is a little chaotic, but then, once check-in is over, then we move to our introduction activity. And we may do a different activity each week, but
Mhm.
that is like the second thing that happens. And then we go sit on the carpet for our Bible story time. And then we go
Mhm.
sit at the tables for our craft. And so I think having a predictable routine to where the steps are
Mhm.
the same each week, you can still, do a different activity during the activity time each week.
Right.
But kids know to expect that, okay, after our circle time where we do our Bible lesson, then after that, what comes next is the activity time. And so that's a way to have that structure and that routine without it being repetitive, because you can do different crafts, you can do different activities, you can do different review games
Mhm.
each time to keep it fresh, but also have it be predictable of what's going to happen next.
Right, right. For sure, for sure. Some of the things that logical learners really enjoy doing, we mentioned before, we talked about numbers and how they enjoy numbers. They enjoy sequential activities, science activities, things that they can design, materials that they can invent, things that they can engineer, patterns that
Mhm.
they can find or create. So you're looking at those kinds of activities as being something that they're going to really focus on, that they're going to really bring in a lot of excitement for, but they're also
Yeah.
gonna really connect with those activities and enjoy them, and so anytime we can have those kinds of activities, it's
Mhm.
incredibly helpful.
Mhm.
Logical learners enjoy board games. I love incorporating board games into a class time because I enjoy being able to review with board games. So even if you can just create your own little board game or something with just a numbered cube and some little tops to the magic markers as the things that move around, and just actually just do a color path and
Mhm.
just have a review game where when they land on the red spot, they pick up the red construction paper that has the review question that's in red. And so it's just those simple little board games that you can
Mhm.
create or that you can bring in that will help you to be able to review a story or a life application or a concept is going to be something that they enjoy to do. They enjoy riddles and brain puzzles and the games, like, for example, if you can do uh, Wheel of Fortune type games or Scrabble type games or crosswords or word
Mhm.
searches, any of those kinds of things where you can bring in things where they have to sit and logically think through a puzzle to try to figure it
Mhm.
out is going to be something that they're going to really enjoy doing. So the idea here is, especially if you have a challenging child in your classroom, one of
Mhm.
the things that I always recommend is if you can find the learning style of that
Mhm.
child, then you can find activities and things that you can really draw their focus in better. And so
Mhm.
that's one of the reasons why we've been doing this series to help you as well, because there are going to be some years that you may have a classroom. If you're a classroom teacher and you teach third grade every single year, some years you may have several logical learners in your classroom. Some years you're going to have verbal learners, and some years you're going to have reflective learners. And so
Mhm.
you're going to have all sorts of different kinds of kids. And it's not that not all different types of learning styles will enjoy board games and riddles and brain puzzles. They will, but especially those kids that tend to lean more towards learning in those
Mhm.
ways, those are the kids that are
Mhm.
going to be the most engaged and get the most out of those activities. So, anytime you can try to think through the personalities and the learning styles of the kids in your classroom, this is only going to help you be able to make it more engaging and more exciting for them. We hope that this information has been helpful. We hope that you have found something that has inspired you or will make you think about doing something differently in a classroom or with your leaders. Our heart is to try to meet you where you are and to be here for you. So we would love it if you would let us know what topics of information you want to hear about. If you can drop us an email or send us a message to let us know a topic that you would like
Mhm.
to hear us chat about, we would love to be able to do that and would love to hear from you. We would ask that you would like and subscribe and all the things. we have some really exciting things planned for the next few weeks. And so we're hoping that we're going to be able just to provide more information for you
Mhm.
and to be able to meet your needs in even more exciting ways than we have already. And so we appreciate your encouragement in that, and how you have stuck with us and how you're patient through all of the insanity that happens sometimes. But hopefully we will be able to hit the topics that are the most important to you. That's really what we're hoping for. So we hope that you have a wonderful week, and we will talk to you again soon. Bye bye.